Now that we're satisfied that we've got some people here, I'd like to make a start for this webinar. My name's Andy Ledger. I'm the Business Development Consultant for DPAS, and I'll be your host for today. We're delighted to welcome you today. We're delighted to welcome you to the webinar today. Obviously, AI and machine learning is a hot topic at the moment, and that's evidenced by the fact that we've got a record number of people that have actually signed up for this webinar today. I think when I last heard yesterday, there was over 300 people signed up for it, so that demonstrates the level of interest for it. I'm going to do the introductions in a minute, but before that, I'm just going to run through some housekeeping. Okay, so if you've got any questions, please use the chat box that you've just been using to say hello. That's great. Just to let you all know, particularly as you're all information governance and data protection specialists, this webinar is being recorded. So if you miss something, you can watch the recording later. And if by staying in the webinar, you actually consenting to the recording. The webinar is going to last about 60 seconds, or 60 minutes for others, sorry. And we're going to send some wishful thinking.
I think we want to spend a little bit more time, Andy, than 60 seconds.
Yeah, we'll see how it goes. We'll send out some materials afterwards, including recordings, additional resources afterwards. After the webinar is over, we'd really appreciate it if you could take a few minutes to complete the survey, because we do look at them closely and use it to plan out future sessions. So without further ado, I'll introduce myself. Emma Martins has got some, in time-honoured fashion, has got some technical problems. So she's going to join us later. So just for the time being, it's myself and Nish. And I'm just going to hand over to Nish for him to introduce himself.
Thanks, Andy. Let's hope I can do actually my introduction, hopefully in about 60 seconds or less.
Yeah.
Hello, everyone. I'm really delighted to see that there's quite a few people joining this session. I'm Nish, and I'm the Global Privacy Counsel for Vodafone. I've been at Vodafone for about 3 years. My responsibilities are across supporting the global privacy program, as well as the emerging responsible AI program, and other digital or data regulations such as Digital Services Act and Data Act. So I am a lawyer, so I support the legal and regulatory side, but I also support the kind of more building of the certain components of different programs, such as the Responsible AI program. I'm very excited to be here.
That's great. Thank you very much, Nish. Okay, so what I'm going to do is pitch a number of questions to you, and we'll just take the conversation from there. As I said at the start of the webinar, if people are welcome to, and here's Emma. Emma.
Emma's managed to join us. Let's go back to the introduction.
Yeah. Hello, Emma.
Hi.
So you managed to overcome your technical problems.
Well, in theory.
In theory, while you're here. And would you mind just introducing yourself and just giving a bit of background to your career?
Firstly, apologies for that. Best laid plans. I was on really early, so my apologies. And hello, everybody. Hi, Andy. Hi, Nish. So sorry. So yeah, I'm Emma Martins. I've been in data protection for too long, more longer than I care to admit. I started out life as a DPO many years ago in the public sector. And most recently, I've worked in regulation, and I've been working in regulation for a very long time. I'm not a technology expert, but I've worked in data and regulation for a long time.
Okay. Just to update you, Emma, I've got a series of questions here that we've pre-prepared, but also I'm really hoping that as the webinar progresses, people will pitch in with their own questions so that we can, get some insights into what people are interested in. Okay, so a nice warm-up question, and I'm going to start with Nish here. Why is the subject of AI and data privacy so important to discuss today?
Yeah, thanks, Andy. Great question. It's possibly a question that I think a lot of people are asking themselves. Why are we talking about AI so much? Why is the subject of data privacy in AI particularly important? I mean, I think it's worth noting that a few things have happened that have led to us sort of coming up with this particular topic. Because AI, well, data privacy as a concept's been around for a long time, and so has AI. But what has happened, I suppose, is with the development in this technology, making it very easy for us to access. So with the release of the ChatGPT models, I suppose what's different from a couple of years ago is when you talked about AI, it was always something that felt like something locked away in a room, whereas now it's widely accessible, and it is capable of doing many interesting things, I suppose. But one of them is like generating this sort of like human-like conversations, generating images, videos, and various other media formats, sounds as well, music, for example. So there's been, an increase, I suppose, in the development of the technology itself, and then the deployment, I suppose, in different kinds of use cases or areas of our everyday life. Apple has just recently released a phone, the iPhone 16, which is the intelligent phone, so it's all integrated with AI technology. There are many kind of IoT products and services that have been, ingested with AI capabilities. And then sort of almost in parallel, there has also been movements in the regulatory landscape. So with arguably the most comprehensive regulation from the EU, we have the EU AI Act, which is due to it's sort of phased deployment, but essentially all of the obligations under the EU AI Act, which will apply to AI products and services.
So we'll get into some of that detail shortly. That's a lovely comprehensive answer. Same question to you, Emma. Why is it so important that we're talking about AI here and now?
Well, it's already here, and I sort of resist this sense that we sometimes see in the media and the narrative that it's something that's coming. Well, it's here, and we're very familiar with it. We might not call it AI, but we use it every day, and it's used on us every day. And I think it goes with AI, and we'll go on to what that means in a minute, I think, but this gets to the questions of issues of power, of society, of our social fabric, of our economy, of our politics, of our rights and our freedoms, of our health. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. I mean, it's shaping our entire world. It's shaping our individual lives. It's shaping our lives collectively. So it's something we need to be talking about because of that. And there are people, as we know, with vested interests in this space for all sorts of different reasons. And I personally think there's a lot of hype, too much hype. So the smoke and mirrors thing isn't helpful. We need to be really clear-eyed about what we're dealing with. So it's important that we all get involved. I mentioned at the beginning, I'm not a tech expert, but that's okay, right? We need lots of different voices in this conversation. No one should be without a voice. No one should be without a part to play in this. So because this can't be an issue that is owned or directed or influenced by a small minority of people. It's been like that for too long, I think. So we all need to be part of the conversation because it affects us. It doesn't affect someone else or something else. It affects us. And just quickly, if anyone was listening to the Congress hearing yesterday in the US about the CrowdStrike outage, fascinating to listen to if you get a chance to hear it. But one of the congressmen said that I think I took the quote down, he was just scared of AI. I mean, we can't be in a world where people in power are talking in that way. We've got to engage with it more constructively and, as I say, in a really clear-eyed way.
That's great. That's a lovely start as well, Emma. And we'll hopefully go back into some of the ethics around the use of AI in a wee while. Just to take a little step back, and I'll go back to Nish now for this question, to start this question. going back to basics, can I have a really quick definition from you about what AI and machine learning is?
Sure. I think there's a lot of ways to describe this, and it's probably one of the most challenging questions to answer. There is, I'm sure, a mathematical answer to this, but I'm going to try and give the one I provide whenever I'm asked a question. Essentially, artificial intelligence is a computer system or a set of systems or machines that is designed to perform certain tasks that require human intelligence. So these tasks could include analyzing data, recognizing patterns, making decisions, and even as I talked about earlier, engaging in conversations. And so, AI can range in terms of complexity, it can range in terms of autonomy, in size and versatility. So you have everything from very, very simple AI, so things that are have a very, I suppose, finite set of roles. And then you have more general purpose AI that actually have a broad range of capabilities that can do probably not just one thing, but a handful of things, more than a handful of things perhaps, depending on the size. So that's how I would describe AI. It is a machine that's designed to do something that requires human intelligence.
That's great. And just moving on to Emma now, just to move the conversation forward a little bit. How does AI typically handle personal data?
Oh, goodness me. Well, firstly, not all AI needs personal data or has personal data. And so I think it's important that we don't just demonize it because it by definition. But big data is catnip to AI, right? So it needs it, it feeds off it, it uses it in all sorts of ways. And there are some really good things that can be done. So again, I think it's important that those of us in this profession don't just by default say AI is a problem, whatever we mean. And it's so interesting to hear Nish talking about the definition, because I just don't think there is. I'm a huge bookworm, but lots of books on AI and ethics, and not one of them gives the same definition. So I think that tells you sort of where we are. We don't even know what the word intelligence means for humans, right? So yeah, anyway, don't get me started on that. So I think we're talking about lots and lots and lots of data, and that will only increase. So it typically handles personal data because it needs it. The interesting stuff that went on last week, I think it was last week, with LinkedIn, hoovering up our data. Some of us would have opted out of that. So it just needs it to survive. I know that will follow on. What follows on is lots of questions about ethics and privacy, but the simple answer to that, Andy, is it just needs a lot of it. And I think we sometimes the scale of it is almost hard to imagine. So I think it's really important, again, that we are clear-eyed about the amount of data and the type of data that is now being harvested and used and will continue to be in the future.
And just to go back to you again directly, Emma, just in terms of concepts like privacy by design and so on, where does that fit with AI? And again, to take a step back, just so everybody's clear, what is privacy by design, and where does that fit with AI?
Well, it's I don't want to oversimplify it, but it's just building it in from the outset. It's sort of baking it in from the beginning. So you sit around with your design team or whatever the team is that's building whatever the product is, whatever the outcome is you're seeking. And from day one, and it's such a simple thing to say, but it's so often missed, from day one, those individuals who care about data governance, who care about data protection and data privacy, all those good things, they are in the room. And, there's a lot of criticism around GDPR, UK GDPR and other GDPR equivalent legislation, but it gives us really, really important bedrocks in this space of accountability, of data protection by design and by default. So these things are not optional, right? They're in legislation. And if we start to frame AI as something which is sort of other, something out with our normal conversations, then that's not going to help us just treat this as if this is what we do with other data, so we need to do it with this data. If there's personal data involved, if there is going to be personal data involved, then the GDPR rules kick in, and we need to be accountable. We need to be transparent. We need to build in data protection and data privacy by design and by default. Those words are what they say on the tin, and I think we need to be very careful not to assume we need a whole new set of regulatory rules and laws, all of those things. I'm not saying that there isn't room for conversation around that, but the GDPR gives us a really good basis. And I just want to very quickly mention something. Some of you might have heard a story in the news last week about GPs in the UK using AI in their practices. And one thing that they said in I think it was a British Medical Journal, said that these findings signal that GPs may derive value from these tools, particularly with administrative tasks and to support clinical reasoning. However, we caution that these tools have limitations since they can embed errors and biases. We're talking health here, right? They may also risk harm and undermine patient privacy, since it's not clear how the internet companies behind the generative AI use the information they gather. It remains unclear how legislation will intersect in a practical way with these tools. And I just resist that. The legislation is clear. So the fact that you've got in a health environment, people at the very top saying, not really sure how the law applies to this. We're using potentially patient identifiable information in a GP surgery, but does the law apply? I don't know. I just think, how did we get to a place where there's such ignorance of some of the basic foundations of getting this stuff right?
Sure. Do you want to comment on that, Nish?
I suppose I bring just to maybe perhaps bring a bit more of a practical organizational perspective on what privacy by design or by design looks like. When we're talking about mitigating certain AI risks. So by design for us, the Vodafone means that we build the controls and we implant the guidances, as Emma said, at the design stage. So when we talk about AI as a product, it has a very similar life cycle to most products. It has an idea stage, it has a design stage, it has a development stage, it has a deployment stage, it has an operational stage, and it has a decommissioning stage. And you're going to have the strongest influence at that design stage. So putting in place certain requirements that are contextual to the respective teams. So it doesn't help, I suppose, to sit there with a technology team and come up with a bunch of lofty principles and say you must be X, Y, and Z. It's not very helpful. You need to think about their language and drafting guidances and requirements for them that make sense to them in their context. So that's what by design looks like for us. And you can start this. One of the things we've noticed as well that AI can come to your organization in various different stages. If you're in the benefit of being in a company that's actually developing this technology, fantastic, then you'll have a lot of influence at the idea stage. But then I would think that most of the organizations are more likely to be consuming these from third parties. So then you need to think about, okay, your supply chain. How do you put the right protections in place in your supply chain and governance? Just if it's okay, just going back to some of the earlier topics, I don't know if we're okay for time, but there was something about privacy risks and AI. And I think, it's important to know that AI brings its own risks, objectively and separate from privacy. But where privacy is involved, one of the things that Emma was talking about that I'd like to build on is this principle that, in order for AI to kind of operate, it needs to consume large amounts of data. Now, not all of that data needs to be personal data, but if it is personal data, then we have to think about how does this meet the data minimization principle under GDPR. You can see there's a natural contradiction there. And then one of the other things we need to think about is, data subject rights. How do you enforce these data subject rights? Let's say a deletion request or a data subject access request when personal data is in these vast systems. How does it work practically? Does the system that you are using or built that is processing personal data have a means to actually extract this or comply with a specific request? And the other thing is around, and last 2 points is around making sure that purpose of your processing is still aligned, because you have to make sure that that processing personal data in AI systems is still consistent with the purposes, the lawful basis that you set out. And if you're able to find one, you also need to make sure that you're adequately transparent to your customers or your employees, whoever the data subjects are. Because that's quite important. And one of the key principles as well in AI alone is transparency. So yeah, just wanted to just bring up those topics too. But
Sure.
I don't know if there was anything else we wanted to kind of go down.
Yeah, well, actually, we've had a question from one of the delegates here, which I'll just bring in. I'll let you both, I'll put the question to you and let you decide who wants to go first on this one. But how can generative AI using personal data comply with and meet the principles of the UK GDPR? Who wants to take that one first and who wants to follow up?
Go on, Nish. You know you want it.
Yeah, no, I think that so the question is, how can generative AI using personal data comply and meet the principles of the UK GDPR? How can its use be transparent, lawful, limit the personal processing, minimize data that's processed, and manage data retention? That's quite a lot of things to think about when you're talking about generative AI use that is using personal data. And again, it goes back to some of the topics we've just discussed. So making sure, for example, that your privacy by design is implemented the right way. Limiting the purpose of processing. So at the design stage or the outset of a specific project, you're very clear about what is the purpose for for the personal data processing, and making sure that in the context of a generative AI use, that it's still consistent. If it's not consistent, then you don't potentially have the right basis, and you might need to think about how you need to manage that. Data retention is, I think data retention has always been very interesting because it's always been a challenge. I don't know, Andy, if you've had lots of organizations that have come to DPAS about dealing with data retention as a separate topic on its own, but it is a challenge on its own. I think that AI is going to make data retention challenges perhaps even worse, because as we said before, there's large amounts of data that needs to be held on to, and the idea of deleting data and only keeping it for a certain proportionate amount of time is in many ways an alien concept for many data scientists, because they want to keep hold of as much data as possible. I think, yeah, I don't want to keep going on. Emma, if you wanted to add your 2 cents on this.
I mean, it's a really comprehensive response, but I would say, sort of from the regulatory perspective, we have seen some regulatory interest, shall I put that in air quotes, around data scraping and things like that. So I think that the difficulty, and I can say this now, I'm no longer a regulator, it's just the reality is it's very, very difficult environment to regulate well and regulate in a way that is meaningful when you've got challenges around resources, you've got challenges around the speed of these developments. But I do think when looking at the GDPR standards, that sort of purpose issues, the transparency, the fairness, the retention, as Nish just said, they're all quite difficult. It's quite difficult to square that circle when you're looking at some of the practices. And I do think that we will probably look back in 10 years' time and say it's all a bit Wild Westy, wasn't it, this period? Because I think we're sort of starting to find the norms around and the values around some of this stuff. But one of the things that worries me the most around these sort of advancing technologies is they're often done just because they can be, not because they should be. And that loops back to what Nish said earlier about being really clear about what your objectives are, what your purpose is. Because I just resist this, let's do it just because we can, because I just don't think that leads to good outcomes. And that's not by definition building in data protection and privacy by design either.
Okay, we have another interesting question from the audience. Can you explain the difference between AI and automated decision making?
Definitely one for Nish.
Yeah, I'd like to, if that's okay. So automated decision making is essentially a rules-based system. So, on sort of like predetermined, what's the phrase, algorithm. So For example, you know, it is if X equals this number, then Y. So it is a sort of conditional rules-based system that doesn't need a human intervention. So basically, the best example of an automated decision making is the credit assessment. So if you've ever been privileged enough not to go for a Wonga loan, but if you were to apply, you can they have these signs like apply in minutes. It's because they have a set of rules that say if you meet this threshold, then X. AI is very different in the sense that it can learn from data, can learn from input, and its decision making isn't stagnant. It doesn't stay the same. And I think that the difference, I suppose, is that, and that's where the intelligence part comes in. And then we have lots of debates about what intelligence means, but this is about essentially, a system that can, in a way, evolve with the number of times you kind of use it. So that's the difference between like an automated decision making and an AI system. ADM, or automated decision making, is strict rules-based system, whereas AI can learn and adapt.
Oh, great, that's lovely. Okay, so a question for you now, Emma. How do we let people know we're using AI, and do we actually have to tell them?
Well, again, I am still a fan of GDPR and the principles behind it, and you look at the requirements around accountability, around information to be given, and I do think there is an obligation, because I don't, as I say, it is a bit Wild Westy. So going back to that GP's example, if I'm going to my GP and they're using AI in a way that is not considered from a privacy perspective, I think I need to know. Firstly, I don't think it should be done in the first place, but I think we do have a challenge in this arena, because Nish is an expert in the technology side of things, and there is a disconnect between the technologists and others, because it's quite unfathomable sometimes. And that's a little bit why when I mentioned the congressman earlier saying he's terrified of AI, because it just feels impenetrable if you are a non-techie. So I think we need to get over that, and that raises challenges about how we explain and how we are transparent and how we are accountable in this environment. But I think one of the things that interests me, that if Nish, to use your job title, but your title is Global Privacy and I think Responsible AI Council. And I just think that's really interesting, that it's not just privacy and AI or technology or whatever, it's responsible AI. And that's Vodafone, and there are other phone companies available. But I think it points to the fact that it's now being wrapped up in sort of trust and confidence in a brand. So it's a bit like if I get on a plane, I don't need to know how the engine works or how to fix it if it's a problem, but I need to trust the brand to get on the plane in the first place. So I think we're seeing a move towards a different relationship around trust and confidence in this area, and damage to trust and confidence when companies do bad things, not always intended. But as I always say, unintended is not unforeseen, going back to privacy by design. I think that the consumer, I hope, will get more savvy and will punish those companies that do bad things and reward the companies that do good things.
And just following on to that, you were sort of mentioning about transparency and so on. Do you both think that AI providers are being sufficiently transparent about the sources of the data they're using when they're training the models? And do they need to enhance this transparency?
No and yes. Over to you, Nish.
I'm going to make this fact-based, actually. I mean, I have some very strong, arguably provocative opinions on this, but I can just stick to facts-based. I mean, the best example of this was, I think it was the Wall Street Journal interview with OpenAI at the cusp, or at least following the release of their new video generating model called Sora AI. And the CTO was just questioned about the new model and how fantastic it was able to generate very cute dogs rolling in the snow. And that's all fantastic. And the journalist made an observation that some of the videos that Sora AI was generating was very similar to certain other videos that are available online. And so therefore the CTO was posed the question, does OpenAI or do OpenAI scrape YouTube videos to generate this new content? And I think stumped is the word. I think that the CTO was certainly stumped by the question, because didn't really provide a reasonable answer or a satisfactory answer, but frankly didn't really know. I think the stock response was that we use licensed and publicly available data. But YouTube is publicly available, but it has a specific, YouTube creators and content owners. They own their videos. You can't just take someone else's video and then pose it as your own, because there is a license restriction to do so. So I think based on that, and also, when we talk about transparency, there's also another topic here. It's about explainability, about the way these models work. And even Sam Altman himself has come out publicly to say that he doesn't understand what goes on in these black boxes. You ask it a question, we reasonably understand that when you say, when you are interacting with, let's say, ChatGPT, we would kind of understand that it's about prediction on a large scale. It is, the sky is ... fill in the blanks, ChatGPT, and it will search through lots and lots of data that's available on the internet, and it will say maybe it's blue because that seems to be the most common answer, perhaps. So that's how it responds. I don't think so. It's a short answer to that question.
And over to you, Emma.
I totally agree. I couldn't agree in any stronger ways. So I think that there's an awful lot of work to be done. And again, I think we're in the middle of a bit of a, what's the old, a long time ago, management training, was it storming, forming, norming, that sort of thing. Those of you are old enough to remember, remember it well. I think we're sort of storming at the minute. And I think we're starting to see signs of forming something, but it's so fractured. And as much as I think good regulation should be an enabler. I think it's very difficult when you've got organizations, probably Vodafone's one of them, that are working cross jurisdictions, when you've got a sort of patchwork of regulations. So I think you've got a way to go before it starts to look anywhere near norming. Yeah.
And I've got a nice succinct question here. Yes or no? Will the UK benefit if there's an existing common AI policy and common regulatory framework between the EU and the UK?
Yes.
Yes.
Sorry, go ahead, Emma.
Yes.
We both say yes.
Do you want anyone care to elaborate on that at all, or a little?
Go for it. I went first the last time, so it's only fair that you're,
well, I think, no, just to really follow on the comment I made last time, I just think consistency is what's needed for the coalface, for organizations who are actually having to work with this stuff. It's not just robots and Terminator and sci-fi movies. This is people trying to build their business and grow their business and run successful businesses. If you want people to comply with something, you need to make it as easy as possible. It's not to say it's necessarily easy, but as easy as possible. And having fractured regulations and different regulations, different approaches, different regulatory approaches, I just think is hugely unhelpful in that environment. That's my view. Right?
Yeah, I think the UK has historically been a leader when it comes to, leading regulatory and legislative, initiatives on things that impact society. There are many examples. I can't even think of one specific one now. I don't know necessarily whether the UK needs to kind of follow a very comprehensive approach like the EU, but I think something would be helpful. The Labour government seemed to indicate, at least in I think it was Keir Starmer's speech, that they are looking at AI regulation for the UK. I do think that something that is pragmatic and, as Emma said, easy to follow, that is both innovative and establishing these guardrails is very important. So it's a hard balance to hit. I admit. I'm I don't sit there writing laws and regulations. Sounds like a great job. But I understand the challenge. I think it's very difficult to toe that sort of balance.
Okay. I'm going to start sort of wrapping up the question and answer session shortly. But here's a really brief question, but actually you could probably write volumes of books on it. What are the ethical considerations and challenges of using AI? Anybody?
You go first, Nick. I went first last time.
Okay, so I mean, it's quite easy to get into quite a deep discussion about the use of AI and the ethics behind it, and so there should be, because as I mentioned before, it's a system that has no soul behind it, and we've got to think about, when I often get asked this question, I try to think about it in very practical terms. And one of the first things we try to do when we kind of inherited the responsible AI policy, as in the privacy team in Vodafone inherited the AI policy, is think about an analogy to help understand the AI and its impact to the workforce and its customers. And it's sort of like trying to imagine AI as a high performance vehicle, or a racing car. Now, it's flashy, it's red, it can get you to a place in very, very, very quickly. But maybe it's not the right thing for picking up your children from school, zipping around at 80 miles an hour. Maybe it's not the right car to use when you're going through rough terrain, you're going off-road. And in many ways, when you think about some of the things we do as an organization, we hire people, we decide that we have the power, I suppose, to determine sometimes where access to certain services and stuff. And I think for me, where I think about where the ethics part comes up is that are there some decisions just better left to humans? And is it ethical, for example, for us to leave certain decisions to AI systems? I know, Emma, you have one about the GP practice, but one of the ones I remember, it sort of stuck with me, is in the States, in North America, they had this program called the Compass program, and there's a website you can go and have a look at this yourself. But they essentially used an AI algorithm to determine the likelihood of reoffending of people in prison, and they found that the tool itself was incredibly biased towards African Americans because of the way the data, the training data was set. So whereas a man who had violently attacked someone, and a young African American girl who had a few thefts and stuff like that, it would rank her as someone who's at higher risk of committing a serious offense in the future. So there's an ethical question there. Is that, well, is that the right use of AI in that particular area?
So you're sort of saying it's a high performance vehicle, but are the brakes good enough? Is that right?
Yes, yeah, exactly. Are the brakes good enough? But then sometimes you just don't want to whip out your motor in random places. Maybe you take the Ford Focus. It makes a bit more sense.
Excellent. And Emma, before we move on to sort of real life examples and case studies and so on, have you got anything to add to that?
I have.
Yeah, I thought you might have.
Can I just encourage anyone who's tuning in to have a look at it's ProPublica.org and do a search for ProPublica racial bias to look at that example that Nish talks about. It's absolutely fascinating, and I think we need real world examples of where sometimes and often the most vulnerable in society and the least powerful, this impacts them. Ethical considerations of AI are huge. This technology is no longer neutral. We can't say that anymore. Where there's big data, where there's personal data, there are big ethical considerations, because we need to know, who has our data. What happens to our data essentially happens to us as individuals, us as human beings. What are they doing with our data? How is it going to impact us today, and how will it impact us tomorrow, importantly? Personally, I think, Nish talked earlier about sort of human-like conversations that AI, we can interact with it and it becomes human-like. I find that utterly terrifying, because that's not just that's basically trying to influence our behavior. So again, Nish's example of the car, you get in the car and it's you have no autonomy, so it's not just your car to drive, it's driving you somewhere where you didn't even think you wanted to go, right? So we're in a different realm. And I think if you start to manipulate people, even if you give good people bad information, they will likely make bad decisions. There's a great story on this week about how the Republicans are spreading this video of Harris and saying that she's a communist, and targeting the Latino exiles who are particularly vulnerable to that message. And now staggering stats that there are 36.2 million eligible Latino voters in America, 14% of the electorate. So these are real world consequences here. So yes, I love the analogy of the car, but it's another level here, because the car is potentially taking us somewhere and we have little, if any, option in that respect.
Yeah.
So hugely ethical, yes.
Okay. So as we sort of start to wrap this up, do we have any more sort of real world examples or case studies or issues that you've come across or your colleagues have come across that you've had to consider or you're in the process of considering?
Thankfully, I haven't had any kind of ethical dilemmas at work in the organizational context, which is actually a good thing, if you can imagine. I think having to wrestle with some of these issues in an organization like Vodafone would be an alarming thing. And I suppose the question, maybe falls into a bit of culture, like how do we drive the right types of ethical and responsible culture? And in many organizations, those who've joined today will have their own kind of company virtues, values, principles, and it's completely fine to be driven by those, and just making sure that is what drives their AI. I think the biggest issue I find when it comes to sort of like this fairly confusing, we want to use AI everywhere, we're trying to commercialize as much as possible. The best way to kind of hone it is to think about, well, what is really your company's value, and what is your organization's kind of principles? Does this particular use case or this AI system align with that value? And then and then that's the first thing. I think you look at the values, you look at the principles that your organization is founded on, and then you look at your commercial strategy. Does this actually align with what we want to do, and is this going to make us any money? And I think with those two kind of the great filters, you'll have a good way of siphoning off something that is most likely going to be very helpful. So that will be my kind of last sort of takeaway, I suppose, on the ethics of AI.
Yeah. The question from me, really, just sort of listening to this debate, is one of the things that I'm getting sense of is there's obviously a lot of unknowns out there about AI and a lot of misconceptions, but is one of the challenges that we face with AI the fact that our lawmakers, the people that are in charge, don't really understand it. They don't understand the capabilities, the benefits, but also the risks that are bringing, and that makes it very difficult for them to come up with a kind of balanced approach to this. Emma?
Shall I go? I mean, I think there's a degree of truth in that, and having been in regulation most of my life, I do have some sympathy with that, though. And I think that we need to appeal to more. I often say this, that if you only comply with something because you fear enforcement, that's sort of morally bankrupt, right? You do the right thing because it's the right thing. And if we can build that culture that Nish just talked about in organizations, and as consumers start putting that pressure on, look what happened with LinkedIn last week. It went like wildfire around my connections, certainly, that it was starting to use data for AI and you could opt out and here's how to. And that was great. That's consumers in action. So yes, it's not to avoid the question. I think lawmakers do have difficulty, but never forget that lawmakers are taxpayer funded. The money has to come from the state, money has to come somewhere, right? And you are invariably, as a regulator, outgunned by the commercial organizations that you regulate, especially in the larger jurisdictions. So we have to sort of confront that honestly and say, well, what is the alternative? And I think if you look to questions of the environment, that really hasn't been prompted by law. That's been prompted by social conscience. And I think we need to try and probably strive for the same thing. It's not to say that the laws aren't needed as well, but let's not look only to legislation to fix this.
And Nish?
Yeah, I mean, I think, making sure that those who are making the laws and regulations, drafting the laws and regulations, understand what it is they're trying to regulate is incredibly important. Because if they don't understand what it is they're trying to regulate, you're going to have all sorts of harmful outcomes. And harmful outcomes could also mean harmful commercial outcomes as well. So, when an organization's success and a sector's success and ultimately the economy's success does rely on the advance in technology and in it being used in different and productive ways. But I think talking about regulators, but also your top management, in your organizations, they will be responsible for setting the rules and of your own organization. So they need to understand very clearly articulated the risk and the reward of using AI. And that will then allow them to make the decisions that's right for their company and their customers. I don't know if you want to touch on training, because culture and training is a very important has a very important relationship, I think. And because while AI itself, as we've already discovered, not a new topic entirely, and privacy either, not a new topic, I think the risks and trying to understand how these AI systems work and what privacy risks may emerge is still a kind of fairly nascent emerging area. And it's very important to understand, to train yourselves to make sure that you're getting the right it doesn't mean having the nice certifications, and obviously those really help for various other reasons, but making sure that you're constantly making sure that you're training across the regulatory landscape, how that's changing, what are those requirements, and then also how AI works. And Emma, I think one of the first things you mentioned was that we're not technologists by default, right? We are compliance professionals, we are lawyers, we are various sort of governance professionals, should I say. Maybe that's a big umbrella term for all of us. But that doesn't mean that we should just shy away from these topics. We should ask the hard questions. We should try and understand these technologies as much as we can, because it should not be something that's hidden away in a cupboard for us to try and monitor at a distance. We have to understand it to advise properly.
Yeah. Great. So I think we're going to start to wrap this up. So have either of you got anything else that you'd like to add, or any examples or anything of particular interest that you might want to finish on?
Are we on takeaways yet? Or
well, takeaways, absolutely.
Takeaways. Can
That's
I go?
The word I was looking for, Emma. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thanks a lot. I think we should try and resist getting caught up in some of the hype. AI is here. So let's focus on what it is doing, the impact it is having, not what the sci-fi movies tell us it might do. Where there's personal data involved, we need to be really alive to the data protection, the privacy issues, not only of today, but also tomorrow and in the future. And I know I'll repeat myself, but harms often aren't intended, but they are, unintended is not unforeseen, as I always say. So get the right people in the room to allow that foreseeability of harms. I think that's so, so important. And one just final plea, if I may, is to please don't ignore the massive, massive environmental question in this area, the huge data centers that sit behind all us playing around on ChatGPT, you know, the eye-watering storage and the processing power, the energy needed for that is again, we will look back in generations to say, why did they not talk about this more? So we need to talk about that more. And very finally,
sorry, just on that, Emma,
yeah.
will that be a barrier for the kind of the wider rollout globally, really, in terms of the
well, it doesn't seem to be yet, and I think that some of that's because of lack of engagement. We talk about even the language we use, the word cloud. You know, we treat it as ephemeral. It's not. It's really, really solid, and it has a lot of energy hunger, which we need to be alive to. So we can't, on the one hand, wring our hands in despair at using plastic straws and then just pop on ChatGPT. You know, it doesn't square. So, and then another plea to people, and a nice plea, is that there's a super report out called "Governing AI for Humanity" from the United Nations very recently. And at the end of that, it says a lovely, lovely quote at the end of it, that governing AI, it's not technological change itself, but how humanity responds to it that ultimately matters. And humanity is you and me, right? So it's how we all respond to it. And going back to the lovely piece that Nish just talked about, how inclusive these conversations need to be. I'm just here for that.
That's great. What we'll do is we'll circulate some of these things that we referenced in the webinar today when we put the materials out. Nish, some takeaways from you, please.
Yeah, sure. So my takeaways are don't be shy, get in and try to understand as much as you can. Be patient with yourselves, I suppose, because it is an area that's fast moving. Work with your technology partners in your organizations. Build things from the ground up, whether that's relationships or controls that you need to build in, and experiment with it too. AI also has some uses for data privacy, and that's not something that we have explored in this session, but I think it's really worthwhile thinking about how AI can help you and your data privacy organization even more. So it's only by experimenting with it that you start to really understand its full capabilities, and also by extension its limitations. So experiment, and then join communities. There are so many communities being set up by like-minded professionals that are cross-disciplinary: lawyers, technologists, data scientists, cyber professionals, and learn from them, because this is a cross-disciplinary topic, and not one person or one team or one function can own it. It is a responsibility that we all have.
That's brilliant. Okay, so we'll finish on that note. I'd like to say thanks to both of you, Nish and Emma, for your input today. Also, the webinar chat's been very active in terms of people with questions. Sorry, I didn't manage to get around to all of them, really. I didn't want to be flying too many questions at the panelists here. We've had some links, we've had some recommendations about films and documentaries to watch and so on. Just finish on what we DPAS can help you with. I think we're one of the few companies out there at the moment that are actually delivering AI accredited courses. We've got the AIGP, Artificial Intelligence Governance Professional, but we've also developed a number of courses in-house which are CPD accredited, so you get CPD points. So that's things like AI for data protection professionals, 2-day courses, right down to 3-hour courses. It's fair to say, though, that we're actually, obviously this is an emerging and developing field. We're open to ideas and suggestions from people about the types of AI courses that they would like to have and the way that they would like to have them presented to them. In addition to our training, of course, we do offer data protection and AI consultancy services. So, for example, some of our interim and outsourced DPOs are actively involved in that sort of work at the moment. AI DPIAs, data privacy impact assessments, audits and compliance documentation. So I think that's it. I'd like to thank you all for coming to the webinar, for your input. But as I say, I'm going to be interested to see how many people actually joined here, but it was certainly a record-breaking number of sign-ups, which leads me to conclude that I think we should be running more webinars specifically around AI and data protection in the future. And if people can send us in their suggestions about perhaps more specific subjects that they'd like us to drill down into on that. So thank you very much for your time, everybody. Thanks, Nish. Thanks, Emma. And look forward to meeting you all again, unless I've been replaced by an AI robot for future webinars. Thanks very much.